All right. Good evening, everyone. We are Perek Aleph, Halacha Ches of Hilchas Talmud Torah. We spoke yesterday about the laws about when there's a conflict between you and your children, and you both are ready to learn Torah, and you could only have one. We spoke about getting paid to teach. That's a big topic that we did not do nearly enough justice to. However, we will begin 8. We will begin Halacha Ches, and this is arguably where the Rambam should have started his Hilchas Talmud Torah. You remember we spoke a couple of days ago. He starts off with exceptions to who is pater from this mitzvah. Now the Rambam is going to say who is in fact chayav in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. So we say Kol ish mi Yisrael chayav b'Talmud Torah. Everyone. Okay, who is everyone? So every male, because if you remember, we excluded women and avadim and ketanim. Okay, so who's left? Who's the other? I don't know. Let's say a third of the population are men. And then the Rambam goes on to say, Bein ani, bein ashir, bein shalom begufo, bein bal yisurin, bein bachar. It doesn't matter what you are, whether you have money, whether you don't have money, whether you are complete, whether you're lacking, whether you're in pain, whether you're healthy, as they say in marriage, impediments, right? For worse, right? For health and sickness, it doesn't matter anything. Ben Shahaya Zaken Gadol Shatashash Kocho, even if you are 110 years old and you have no strength left, Afilu Haya Ani, so now he's going to go to extremes. He said Ani already. Afilu Haya Ani, Hamisparnis Min Hatzedaka, Umachazer Al Psachim, even though you are a beggar, you are a beggar in Grand Central, and that's how you make your money, right? Afilu Bal Isha Ubanim, right? So it's interesting what the afilus are, right? Even if you have no money, even if you're a beggar, even if you're a regular husband who has children, whatever that means. Chayav likboa lo zman l'talmud Torah b'yom l'layla. You have an obligation to learn Torah during the day as well as during the night. Shenemar v'hagita bo yomim v'layla. Okay, so he quotes a pasuk in Yehoshua, a well-known pasuk, which is often quoted as the chiyuv for Talmud Torah because there's no real clear pasuk in the Chumash that says that it says you have to teach, right? That's what we discussed yesterday. But in terms of learning for yourself, or another way of saying it, toiling in Torah, right? It says in Bechukosai Telechu, but that's not a real concrete pasuk. This is a pasuk everybody loves to quote, which is V'hagita bo yomam v'layla. So just to make a point, the Rambam says Bein Ani, Bein Ashir, Bein Shalem. So the Kesef Mishnah, I'll open up one of the commentaries. He says, so he says, Matinu beGemara, Kama Chachamim Shahayu Cholin Va'anim. Right? The Gemara has no shortage of stories of people who were sick, people who were poor, right? Kumo Rabbi Elazar Bereish, Kumo Rabbi Elazar Barab Shimon Bahapolan. Remember the Gemara that opens up the 7th chapter of Bava Metzia, if you remember, on Daf Pei Dalet, it talks about the story of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Elazar Barab Shimon. There's a whole 2-page Agadata about him. He was a chola. It talked about how he was in pain. He had various stomach ailments, right? Shaya chola. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, the story in Tainus Daf Chav Zayin, right? Also Chanina ben Dosa, and then you have the granddaddy of them all, which was Hillel. Hillel on Daf Lamed Hey, the all-time, not all-time, I say that about everything, definitely top 10 Gemara that says on Daf Lamed Hey that there are 3 kinds of people that are going to give everybody no excuses why we didn't learn Torah, right? I'll just quote the first line of the Gemara is in Yuma Daf Lamed Hey. It says, Tanu Rabbanan Ani va'ashir v'rasha ba'in ladin. Eventually, a poor person, a wealthy person, and a rasha are all going to be coming to judgment and held accountable. La'ani omer lo mipnei malo asakta b'Torah. They're each going to have a potential excuse why they didn't learn Torah. So the Gemara says, well, if the ani says, I was so poor and I spent my whole time begging, they're going to say, you think you're poor? Have you ever met Hillel? And then the Gemara goes on to say the famous story about Hillel, where he was so poor, he wasn't allowed to go into the base medrash, and they found him in December up on a skylight, and he was frozen to death, and then Hillel became Hillel. And then the Gemara talks about another person who was rich, his name was Rabbi Eliezer Bar Charsom, and he had so much real estate, and still he had enough time. And then by the Russia, he wasn't really a Rasha. His name was Yosef HaTzadik. It says, you think because you're a Rasha and you had a Yetzer Hara, that's how the Gemara connects it. Because you think you had a Yetzer Hara, you think that's going to exempt you? Right? On the contrary, it says by Yosef, and then the whole story about Yosef and Potiphar. He had the biggest excuse of all. He was in a palace with a woman who wanted him, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, the moral of the story is, and I tell this a lot to a lot of people who ask me, there are virtually no excuses that a person could ever say they don't have either time or the ability or the access or whatever word you want to use not to be able to learn Torah. YU has, I don't know, something like 67,000 shiurim on their website, right? From like, I don't know, probably 400 different topics, right? We have all daf, we have 9 different magidei shir, right? You could be in the North Pole. You don't even need Wi-Fi anymore. You just download it, right? You go on a plane, it doesn't have Wi-Fi, right? You have 9-hour flight, right? There's absolutely no excuse left that someone could say they don't have time or they don't have the energy, or literally at your fingertips. So that's the modern day interpretation of Yom Hadaf Lamed Hey. Okay, we will continue. Number 9, Tess. Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael hayu mehen chotve eitzin unehem shovei mayim umehen sumen. And the Rambam, almost like what I said a minute ago, goes on to prove this point and says, and if you take a look at it historically, our great Amuraim in the Gemara, all right, and let's see who they were. We need to open up the Kesef Mishnah again, and he gives examples. He says they were chot ve'etzim, right? This sounds like the beginning of Nitzavim, right? Mechotev eitzecha ad shoev meimecha, right? It's not just Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar. The leaders mentioned in the Gemara, nearly on every single daf, all had day jobs. Believe it or not, Hillel was a wood chopper. Says the Kesef Mishnah, v'shoev emayim. Who was a water drawer? Rav Huna, right? If you look in Gemara Ksuvas daf Kuf Hey 105, you'll see that there's a story that Rav Huna, the great Rav Huna, right, who we see every 5-6 blot appears in the Gemara, he actually had a day job, right? He schlepped water. Umehen Sumin, there were people who were blind, right? Remember the 2 famous Amoraim who were blind, Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef. And I think there was a third, but at least we had 2 Amoraim who were blind. V'afal piken hayu oskin b'talmud Torah. They did not use either their ailment or their day job or the fact that they came home and they were probably wiped. They still found time to learn day and night, right? Again, the Rambam says, Bayom uva laila. Very interesting. This reminds me of a Gemara in Shabbos of Lamed Aleph, where one of the questions that they ask you is kavata itim b'Torah, right? Where you kovei azman. So the word kavata is actually, I heard a drasha that it's not interpreted to be koveya, like, right, like set aside time. It comes from the word hayikba, which is a pasuk in Malachi, which means to steal. It means, did you steal time? Right? You have to, if you don't have the time during the day, so you know, like I said before, you download a shir, and when you're online, waiting online, when you're in a gas station, when you're here, when you're there, a few minutes here, a few minutes there, a few minutes there, and there were people who actually, this is not just urban legend, who actually made siyumim on Shas in the time that they spent learning. It could have been 15, 20 years, time that they were busy doing something else, that they were able to steal time. Okay. Anyways, so that's what the Rambam says, that they would learn day and night, even though they had great excuses and they were working and they had this problem and they had that problem. And the Rambam says, Vehen michlal ma'atike hashmua, right? These were people who kept the Masorah alive, ish mipi Moshe Rabbeinu, all the way going back, stretching back from Moshe. So the Rambam, you could see, doesn't give you any leeway. There is a chiyuv, and there is no, again, if you're a male, 13 and above, you have, as far as I could see, little to no excuse about finding time to learn Torah. Okay, so now we'll go to number 9, number 10. Halacha Yud. Ad ema sachai of lilmod Torah. So, are there any days off? Okay, how about, let's say, football Sunday? Right? Do you get any time off? So the answer is no. Ad yom moso. Every single day that ends in Y, until the day you die. Shenemar upen yasura milvabacha kol yemei chayecha. The pasuk in Dvarim says, right, lest you take it out from your heart, kol yemei chayecha. All right, that's a word that's a term we know from Pesach. Kol yemei chayecha, all of the days as long as you are alive. So as long as you're alive and breathing, you have to learn. There's no exemption. The Rambam ends off by saying something that seemingly is not related. He says, "V'chol zman shelo yasok b'limud hu shocheach." Right? If you're not involved, you forget. Meaning, this reminds me of the Gemara in Chagiga that says, "Im tazveni yom yomayim azveka." Right? I think it's in Chagiga daf ches or so. It says that it's like, when people who learn daf yomi, when they miss a day, they're like, "Oh, I got to do 2 today." And if you miss 2 days in a row, oh, I got to do 3. So if you forsake me 1 day, God says, I'll forsake you 2 days. So it's very hard to make up. And that's, I'd probably say, is the number one answer why people are not into specifically Daf Yomi, is that they feel that once they get behind, they will never be able to catch up. Okay. Okay, we got one more very important one. So this is a famous Gemara we have in a couple of places in Sanhedrin. It says you have to divide, right? So the question is, now you have to learn. So the question is, do we learn Rambam? Do we learn Mishnah? Do we learn Musar? Right? So in Yeshivas Elimelech, we have a whole smattering of various different I'll throw in a sales pitch of different shirim during the day, from Daf Yomi to Musar to Chumash Rashi to Rambam and Guide to the Perplexed, right? And all the various. So you kind of get a feeling that there's basically a whole smorgasbord to pick from, and that's what the Rambam says. Kind of, he says you have to divide your day into a third. Shlish b'Torah, well, not your day. You have to divide your time. However time you have, there's 3 components. A third of it is Torah shebichsav, ushlish b'Torah shebal peh, ushlish yavin v'yaskil achris davar mereshiso. Wow. So one is Torah shebichsav. The second is Torah shebal peh. The third one is some kind of, the Rambam says, what is it? Yaskil achris davar. It's understanding concepts from the beginning to the end, v'yotzi davar midavar, and inferring one thing from another, v'yidme davar ladavar, and comparing things, v'yavin b'midos shehatorah nidreshes behen, and figuring out, right, concepts based on the 13 midos, so that you could figure out what's prohibited and what is not prohibited. Right? So that you could come to decisions, right, based on shmua, based on the tradition that we came about in order to derive these laws. So that's a lot of words. So what exactly is this book called? And the Rambam ends off by saying, "V'inyan zehu hanikra Gemara." And this last thing that I said is what we call Gemara 101, right? It's laws that are derived, right? We talk about how do we know this law, where it comes from, and we have a machlokes, and we'll go back and forth, right? And we'll bang our heads for 2 or 3 days sometimes until we figure out how this law came and derived and all of the 101 various ramifications. And I'll just end off by saying that the Rabbeinu Tam, where this Gemara comes up in Sanhedrin, in the second parak of Sanhedrin, says basically, we don't have to learn Torah Shebechsav, we don't have to learn Torah Shebal Peh, we don't have to learn this thing called Gemara. What you do is we have something called Talmud Bavli. And in our Gemara, we have everything. We have Mikra, we have Mishnah, we have Gemara, right? So we have, basically that is what the Gemara is all about. Sometimes, unfortunately, people learn Torah Shebechsav or Navi because the Gemara brings it down. If it weren't for the Gemara bringing certain things down in the Chumash, in the Navi, in the Ksuvim, we wouldn't know them, right? So that way, the Gemara is all-encompassing. And there's a lot to talk about that, but we are done. All right. Until next week. Questions?